Christianity is in the news.
The Archbishop of York
has stepped into the row over whether a British Airways worker can openly wear a Christian cross at work.
Suddenly, more and more believers are ending up in court.
A devout Christian couple have been cleared of insulting a Muslim guest.
There are concerns that Christianity is being marginalised.
Would they do the same with the Quran or the Hindu scriptures or any holy book for that matter?
And that individual Christians are being victimised, persecuted even.
I think if you lose your job because you've offered to pray with a patient, you would call it persecution.
It's the kind of story you would think only happened in places like Pakistan, India or Iraq.
How can this happen in this nation?
5 Live Breakfast, it's exactly 9:30. In my job, I'm no stranger to debate about religious affairs.
It's the Old Testament, New Testament. No, this is key. You have shaved your beard.
But even I have been struck by the sheer number of stories about Christians and Christianity.
So what is going on? Are Christians being discriminated against? Are they being singled out? And if so, how serious is it?
How can 21st century Britain have come to a place like this?
If I was a Christian, I'd be very upset.
And we pray for Ben and Shin.
It's persecution.
Cast your mind back a few months to December, and the most popular festival of the Christian year.
Christmas. It is a great British tradition, part of the fabric of our society, a chance for us all to get together as a nation, celebrate and let our hair down. And it's been like that for hundreds of years. In the 17th century, when they tried to ban it, there was a huge public outcry. But if you believe the papers, there's a far more contemporary threat to Christmas.
In the run-up to Christmas 2009, Dundee Council found itself cast as the villain. Instead of a modest switch-on of the Christmas lights, the city chambers had planned an ambitious evening of entertainment right across the city. The title for such an event needed to be suitably enticing, and so Dundee's Winter Light Night was born. But it wasn't long before some local church leaders protested that the name made no mention of Christmas. Dundee's leader of the administration is Ken Guild.
You're somehow saying that because we're calling it a winter light night rather than a Christmas light night, that we've taken Christianity out of it, which is ardent nonsense. The idea is to get as many people as possible involved, and through that you're exposing them to the Christmas message and to Christmas celebration.
Out on the street, opinions varied on the fuss over what the evening should or shouldn't have been called.
It's not about light, it's not about Santa Claus, it's about Jesus Christ.
At this time of year, if they're having switching on the lights for Christmas, it should mention Christmas in the title.
I understand why they object to it. I think they've got no business at all objecting to it whatsoever. It's a great night, call it whatever you want.
In the end, the council convinced church leaders that they had not meant to sideline Christmas. But according to Ken Guild, Dundee is not alone.
Calling it a winter event is quite common. If you look at our next city up in the northeast, they are calling it the Winter Festival. If you go 20 miles along the road to Perth, the nearest large town, they are calling it Welcome to Winter.
Newspaper headlines from other parts of the country point up the many ways in which the Christian festival of Christmas is being undermined. They suggest that something more might be going on.
I think that what the press have identified is just one of the flashpoints that many Christians see as an attempt to marginalise their faith. But I believe it's part of a bigger picture. It's a story of our times. It's about profound changes we're only dimly aware of, but they are transforming the place and purpose of religion in modern life.
Hey, young people! The J-Rock's back in the house. And so's the G to the...
Today, Christians and Christianity are often seen as fair game.
We're not high on E, we're high on G. O-D. But you can't OD on G-O-D. Because you can never have enough of God's love.
Joking aside, there is evidence that Christianity is being shunned. Even, it seems, in Britain's schools.
A recent report looked into the teaching of RE in schools. It found that most Christian student teachers thought that sharing their beliefs with the classroom could be unprofessional. But it was a different story for agnostics and atheists. They believed that sharing their lack of beliefs or questions with the classroom could be a positive contribution.
I decided to see for myself if this is in fact the case.
Relate to all of us.
What do student teachers at Canterbury Christchurch University think?
What must all teaching be in the classroom in relation to the entire curriculum of religion?
Those who were atheist or agnostic felt more able to discuss their beliefs in the classroom.
I have told a couple of my students, but I haven't told any of my students as a class.
I find it's a nice, easy way to answer the questions, why do we have to learn RE when we're not religious? It's, well, I'm choosing to teach it and I don't believe in any of it, so...
I know that a lot of students don't even know what agnosticism is, so it's quite nice for me to have that opportunity to explain it to them as well.
By contrast, many Christian teachers were reluctant to discuss their beliefs in class.
I'd never share my viewpoint because that is a view that the whole of society would not accept as a view. Being quite conservative in my beliefs, like I guess maybe certain issues with kind of sex and homosexuality and things like that. I'm worried that if I ever did denounce that, I'd get in so much trouble.
When I've had children ask me before, I thought, obviously everyone who believes in this is stupid. So, well, actually, a lot of Christians would disagree with you, rather than saying, my personal belief as a Christian is this. So you word your answers differently.
All these examples add up to what many Christians say is a new threat. After centuries in the mainstream, there are Christians, bishops as well as laity, who feel they are being treated unequally, sidelined, even discriminated against.
Roll on the day when nobody goes to church and we pull the damn things down and make something useful.
Of course, on one level, it is true that the secularization of Western Europe has been pushing Christianity away from the public arena. But that's been a long-term trend. The current disquiet, especially felt by devout Christians, has very different roots. One factor is the sudden and significant changes to the makeup of British society. Immigration. It has brought about a multicultural, multi-faith Britain. Take a town like Rochdale. Most people expected last year's Christmas lights to be the usual display of Santas, snowmen, and a Merry Christmas sign.
10, 9, 8.
But with the countdown to the big switch on, came a twist on the traditional theme.
3, 2, 1.
In 2009, the Muslim festival of Eid was celebrated at the end of November. So the council decided its Christmas lights should reflect this, and the Hindu festival of Diwali, and the Jewish Star of David for Hanukkah, and a pagan Wicca symbol for the winter solstice, and of course, a Merry Christmas sign. This was a multi-faith Christmas, and the Mayor, Councillor Keith Swift, explained why.
That won't let you down. Council does have to take into account the fact that we're now a multicultural nation, and we've welcomed people from all over the Commonwealth, all over the world, to come and live and work here and be part of our community, and we can't therefore ignore their views, and we have to respect their views.
And it's not only Rochdale that is keen to keep all sectors of the community happy. In Tyneside, a mum was told to take down her Christmas lights because they might be offensive to her non-Christian neighbours. In Yorkshire, a college was reported to have replaced Christmas and Easter with end-of-term breaks to be more inclusive. And in Bolton, a survey of employers found 70% planned to ban Christmas decorations at work because they were worried about offending other faiths.
All these examples may strike you as what some term in that hackneyed phrase, political correctness gone mad. Or to put it another way, evidence of zealous councils unquestioningly carrying out multicultural diktats from above.
We decided to ask members of Britain's ethnic communities themselves what they think about Christmas.
Oh, it's okay for me. I like to join in, I don't mind.
I don't really know anybody that complains about the actual Christmas itself or the occasion or the fact that it's a religious thing. I don't really hear anybody complaining about the religious side of things.
Yeah, it would have been nice if they look at other culture festivals as well and pay attention to it, yeah.
I know this is not an Islamic country, so they couldn't be offended in that way, do you know what I mean? I like the fact that Christians celebrate Christmas like that, yes.
One person who sums up the view of many British Muslims is Monawar Hussain. Monawar is the founder of a forum set up to encourage understanding between faiths. He has no qualms about joining his Christian neighbours to celebrate the switching on of their house lights. And he thinks many in Britain's ethnic communities are fed up with being blamed for the renaming of Christian celebrations.
As someone of faith, I want to see my Christian friends be able to share their festivities with us and kind of express that culturally. So in the public space, their faith is also projected. And I have absolutely no problem with that.
Bob, thank you. You're welcome. Pleasure.
And often I think it's local authorities who are ill-advised or sometimes maybe disconnected from local faiths and local culture, or do not know enough about local communities, that they make decisions that are really not in the benefit of local communities.
If councils perhaps did more to find out what minority faiths actually thought about Christian festivals, it would reduce much of the resentment some Christians feel. There are Christians who wonder what the fuss is all about. They welcome what multiculturalism has brought in its wake. But there is another issue stirring up resentment in some Christian quarters. They fear their right to express their faith in public, as they've done for centuries, is being undermined too.
What, for example, if a Christian's personal convictions are not deemed PC enough at work? That's when some fear political correctness tips over into victimisation. And for some at the receiving end, that can very much feel like persecution.
We have 5,000 people signed this petition in a short time.
One such Christian is the reason for this vigil outside Wandsworth Town Hall in London. Up until January 2008, Duke Amakri worked here as a homelessness prevention officer. But he got into a conversation with a client about her health and asked if she had thought about putting her faith in God. 2 days later, he was suspended from work and later dismissed.
I'm very, very grateful that you all have come out to stand with me to see that justice is done.
On the night of the appeal against Duke's dismissal, many supporters turned out, and feelings were running high.
We are somehow sidestepping Christians because we're not violent, because we don't shout from the rooftop necessarily. We're being sidestepped. and that I think I wanted to come out and support this man.
How can this happen in this nation? That is the question I'm asking. How can this happen in this nation?
In the end, the hearing upheld the decision to sack Duke for gross misconduct. He now plans to take his case to an employment tribunal.
Because of her orthodox views, her orthodox...
Duke is not fighting his case alone. Tonight's protest was organised by Andrea Williams.
This evening, because of Duke's living out his Christian faith, he finds himself out of a job. How can 21st century Britain have come to a place like this, in a civilised...
Andrea is a barrister specialising in Christian interest litigation. She's found that over the last 10 years, she's been handling more and more of these cases. By 2007, the number had increased to such an extent that she and a group of like-minded lawyers opened a legal centre to represent Christians.
We've probably got about 50 cases from 2009 that we were actively dealing with, but this doesn't count the inquiries that come in every single day. People saying, are we allowed to distribute Christian tracts? Are we allowed to do carol singing? Are we allowed to sing? Are we allowed to hold up placards? What is it exactly that we're allowed to do? People have become so confused in this country with regard to what they're permitted to say, with what they're permitted to do.
One of the centre's cases hit the headlines early last year.
The lead page of the Mail is a story that a nurse could be sacked and even struck off for offering to say a prayer to an elderly patient.
Caroline Petrie is a nurse and a Christian. She was suspended after offering to pray for a patient.
Well, I just felt numb. For many years I've tried my best as a nurse and always tried to do everything so well in the clinical field. I just thought, well, what have I done wrong? What is it that I've done to get suspended?
Caroline has since been allowed to return to work. But she is baffled by her experience in a profession which traditionally had such close ties to the Christian faith.
In the 30s and 40s, it was the job of the ward nurse to say prayers with the staff and the patients every morning before the shift started. I felt that ministry in the hospital was part and parcel, and I get suspended for offering prayer. There's something really wrong with that.
Another case handled by the Christian Legal Centre is that of Olive Jones, a teacher and a Christian. She got into trouble after offering to pray for a sick pupil, whose parent then complained.
I knew I was in a dire situation. I was shaking so much inside and trembling. And basically, the parents' complaint was about the fact that I had shared my Christian experience and that I had offered prayer. You know, it's as if you are not meant to mention anything concerning God in the workplace.
North Somerset Council say they have agreed with Olive that it can be appropriate for a teacher or tutor to offer to share their faith with a pupil. But careful professional judgment needs to be made as to whether it is appropriate and indeed acceptable to the person or family concerned. The council say they've offered Olive further work, but she has secured alternative employment. But the idea that expressing your Christian beliefs at work could get you into trouble would once have been unthinkable.
You look pretty fed up, Arthur, he says. Yes, I'm fed up to the back teeth. You're a carpenter, aren't you? Jesus Christ was a carpenter, remember? Let's talk about it sometime.
So what has changed? Why are more and more devout Christians feeling unable to express their faith in public? The answer may be found here in the House of Lords. Its record office houses all British law. In recent years, there has been a raft of new legislation based on principles of human rights. Britain signed up to the principles back in 1950 under the European Convention on Human Rights. But it's only in the last decade or so that steps have been taken to incorporate them directly into British law. These are the actual Acts of Parliament, all passed over the last decade or so, designed to bring us into line with European legislation in a whole range of discrimination issues. Their ultimate aim, to make Britain a more tolerant society, and that is a fundamental principle of our liberal democracy. The paradox is that these same laws have left some Christians feeling like a persecuted minority. To understand why, we need to remind ourselves of the laws in question. The first, dating back to the 1970s, aimed to tackle unequal pay, gender and racial discrimination. Then, in 2003, laws were passed to stop anyone being harassed at work because of their religion or belief. That was good news for Christians. And protection was also given to gay and lesbians to prevent discrimination because of sexual orientation. The problem is, the legislation never made clear what would happen in the event of a clash. Whose human right would take priority over the other? It wasn't long before a clash did arise.
For us, this is about making a choice to have our rights acknowledged and protected as any human being.
New legislation gave same-sex couples the right to civil partnerships. Of course, some Christians welcome the new laws, but for others, it created a crisis of conscience.
For Lillian Liddell, her belief is that marriage is the union between man and woman.
Lillian Liddell believes same-sex partnerships go against the teaching of the Bible. But as a registrar for Islington Council, she was now expected to conduct these ceremonies. When she asked to be excused, Lillian was disciplined. She hoped the laws against religious discrimination would protect her. But after 2 tribunals and an appearance at the Court of Appeal, Lillian is still fighting. I wanted to know why in this case, the right to religious belief seemed subordinate to other rights. So I went to talk to the civil liberties group, Liberty, a strong supporter of human rights legislation. Its director is Shami Chakrabarti. Is it an individual human right as part of somebody's faith to believe that homosexuality is profoundly wrong, for example, and to be able to articulate that in the public space?
Well, I think that we have got to a place in modern Britain where we are against bigotry against gay people or members of ethnic minorities. There are some people who might be against my own marriage to someone of a different race, but the law has protected us for many, many years, and in my view, rightly so. I also think that if you're trying to discriminate in a public office, then perhaps you're not a suitable person for that kind of employment.
Supporters of human rights legislation seem to be saying society has moved on and we all need to adapt. But there are some who go further and argue that the pushing of Christianity to the fringes is a good thing. Indeed, for Polly Toynbee, writer and the president of the National Secular Society, there is no reason to give special treatment to Christians or the Christian faith. Do you understand how some Christians feel in this country? That they are being marginalised, pushed aside?
Absolutely not. I can't see any sign of that at all. They are a tiny proportion of the population who actually go to church, any time during the year, let alone every Sunday, and they have enormous privileges. They just forget what it is to be an established faith and all the privileges that come with it. There is a natural tendency these days for everybody want to pretend to be a victim. The one lot of people who aren't victims in this country are the Christians.
But you can't pray for somebody if you're a nurse without it being frowned upon? What's that if it's not being marginalised?
When it comes to nurses and teachers, it's not about their rights to pray, it's about their duty to vulnerable people, vulnerable children, patients, prisoners, and those people should not be in any way pressurised by people in great authority over them to have to pray or not. It's a matter of individual choice and individual sensitivity. But
as long as religion sticks its oar in, is that holding us back as a society? Is religion putting the shackles on us?
I think there is a danger increasingly that religion is taking too big a share of attention in the public space. The idea that we should have special respect for religion, that it should be treated differently to other views. I think this comes partly from nervousness about how to treat the Muslim community fairly, and sometimes that's led to a general making of laws saying religion deserves special respect for all religions.
Whether or not you agree that religion's role in the public arena should be restricted, the fact is that for some Christians, it already has been. For them, the raft of new human rights has accelerated the process. And that makes for quite a break with the past. Whatever your opinion of all this, it's not too difficult to see why some Christians are feeling marginalised. But does any of it matter? Are there reasons the rest of society should feel concerned? Well, a growing number of voices from across the religious spectrum are uneasy about the current secular path. They say fresh human rights legislation could undermine the very principle of a liberal society, tolerance itself. Last year, a new piece of legislation began its passage through Parliament. The Equality Bill. Britain's equality laws have built up piecemeal over 40 years. So the government decided to bring them together into one single Act of Parliament. It seemed like a sensible step, but when the bill came before the House of Lords in January of this year, it rang alarm bells. Some Christians were anxious that in practice it amounted to the most serious assault on religious liberties in centuries. Some believed that it undermined the Church's right to decide on doctrine. The Catholic Church, for example. Many thought it would make it illegal to appoint male-only clerics, opening the way for female priests. You see, historically, churches have had the right to refuse to employ anyone on the grounds of gender, marital status, or sexual orientation. They feared that the new bill would change all of this. For its part, the government insisted that it never intended to apply the new law to ministers of religion. They would remain exempt. Even so, some bishops in the Church of England used their inbuilt advantage as members of the House of Lords to speak out against the bill.
They are not matters for the law to impose. Start down that road and you'll put law and conscience into inevitable collision. And that way actually indeed lies ruin.
For many in the church, the bishop's intervention was long overdue. I've come to the Daily Telegraph to meet a leading religious opinion former. Anglican priest George Pitcher is the religion editor for the paper. He believes the bishop's move was popular because it upheld the wider principle of a religion's right to decide on its own rules.
I'm pleased that they were there to defend our established Church of England and its practices in the House of Lords, because I think that's, if you like, a part of our rich, unwritten constitution. I'm glad that they were intervening in the debate to say what they had to say. I'm wholly in favour of women being priests, and if women are priests, of course they should be bishops. I'm entirely in favour of homosexuals being open about their sexuality and so on. But I think once you start saying that you're not allowed to think that these people are leading sinful lives or are wrong in any way, then we lose that healthy sense of debate.
What's
and
the
I think
difference?
that's prescriptive.
Yes.
And I think that's dangerous.
Is this why so many came in against the legislation? I mean, the bishops?
Well, funnily enough, I think that the threat that is most often cited actually is missing the point. You know, I think that too many Christians are saying we should have the right to discriminate against who we believe should be outside the church. But I think the danger really is in the prescriptive nature of an Equality Act, such as it's constructed, which seeks, if you like, to prescribe how people think and what is right think and what is wrong think. It's quite
like
Orwellian.
A thought crime.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
George Pitcher's views were echoed by others in the Anglican Church. Then, at the beginning of February, the Catholic Church also stepped into the row.
Pope Benedict has criticised the equality bill currently going through Parliament.
The Pope took the highly unusual step of speaking out. He said some of Britain's equality legislation imposed unjust limitations on the freedom of religious communities.
Simply put, the Pope was saying that guaranteeing freedom from discrimination for groups such as gay people is being bought at the expense of his own church's freedom of belief.
His intervention upset many secular voices who argue that any debate on the issue of equality has to be conducted on the basis of reason and reason alone. Ziauddin Sadar is a respected Muslim scholar, a prolific author and columnist for the New Statesman. He's also a former commissioner of the Equality and Human Rights Commission.
In contemporary times, you can't argue from authority or on the basis of dogma. For public space to be productive, the arguments have to be based on reason and rationality. And I think the problem is, for example, the contemporary intervention of the Pope is more or less based on dogma rather than analysing.
What should the Pope have said recently? I mean, he said that this equality legislation was against natural law, which I suppose you would argue is a dogmatic thing to say.
Yeah.
How should he have framed his argument?
Christians, like all people of faith, have to realize that the world changes. Morality is not a static thing. Morality is something that evolves. It's something that we arrive at sometimes by contestation.
Even if it would involve women priests ultimately, or transgendered people working in mosques, that's okay?
Yeah. I mean, either you believe in it. I mean, the thing is that it is not simply enough to say, I believe in equality. You need to delineate what equality means in contemporary times. And equality doesn't have the same meaning for all time, you know.
What if it's against the doctrine as laid down in your holy book?
Well, it has to be reinterpreted.
Easier said than done.
Absolutely, easier said than done. But the thing about Scripture is that nothing in Scripture is kind of defined for eternity. Everything in Scripture has to be negotiated and interpreted. And when you engage with the Scripture, then you bring yourself to it, and you bring your own time, the values and concerns of your time.
And you're including the Quran when you talk about the Scriptures.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But the Catholic Church in Britain welcomed the Pope's intervention. Its recently appointed head, Archbishop Vincent Nichols, says the Pope was warning of a bigger threat. Equality legislation is part of a secular ideology, and it can't be allowed to ride roughshod over religion.
One way in which to understand the tensions around equality legislation is not to think that one is a matter of doctrine and the other isn't. Secularism is a doctrine, and it can be as forceful and it can be as narrow-minded as the worst of a doctrinaire Christian position. So I think it is a question of really opening up a much more constructive dialogue. And I think the threat that he sees is much more a threat to the quality of the life of Europe. So I think he's much more interested in saying the human good, the good of society, will be damaged if this, as it were, source, this rich vein of generosity and goodness is switched off and is sent underground, is sent out of the public sphere.
It's no surprise that the Catholic and Anglican churches were ready to fight for religious freedom. They're trying to defend rights and privileges they've had across Europe for centuries. But perhaps what is surprising is that a growing number of non-Christian voices seem to share the Pope's anxieties. They too believe that equality laws are putting the fundamental liberal principle of tolerance under strain. In fact, Britain's chief rabbi goes further. He argues that limiting religious freedoms goes against the spirit of the first human right, won over 300 years ago.
Rights are a good thing, and they arose really in England in the 17th century after a century of religious warfare throughout Europe, when, to put it bluntly, Protestants and Catholics were killing one another. So the major question was, how can people of strongly conflicting religious beliefs live peaceably together? People stopped saying religious faith is supremely important, therefore everyone should have my religious faith, to saying religious faith is supremely important and therefore everyone should have the right to the faith that they in conscience believe. And with that one simple move, religion turned into a friend of liberty instead of being its enemy. That's why it becomes ironic when rights themselves become a threat to religious liberty.
What religious voices are saying is that whilst equality legislation confers all manner of new rights and freedoms, it's also undermining religious freedom. And it now seems a good number of us share that worry. We commissioned a special poll to find out if people think Britain is becoming more or less tolerant of religion. Our poll revealed that people are divided about whether we really are more tolerant or not. Indeed, of the 1,000 people polled, the biggest group, 44%, actually thought Britain is becoming less tolerant. It's a paradox. The boom in individual rights and freedoms is not matched by a corresponding sense of a rise in tolerance. Ironically, one reason may be an unintended effect of the equality laws. Human rights legislation can create a raft of potentially competing freedoms.
Going green isn't just about making energy savings. It carries the same weight as a religion.
An artist should be free to practice their art. And if the artist wants to rip up a book, it doesn't matter what book it is.
When it wasn't so long ago, the Nazis were burning Bibles and defacing them, ripping the pages out.
Hindus and Sikhs are preparing for Diwali, but people who work won't automatically get time off to celebrate.
It's a recipe for conflict. Away from the law courts, it's raising deep questions about our commitment to liberty. Roger Trigg, a philosopher at Oxford University, worries that nowadays almost any right will trump the right to Christian belief. He points to the recent case of the Christian registrar at Islington Council, who got into trouble for asking not to carry out same-sex civil partnerships.
Principle was they were against discrimination, but they were against discrimination of people on grounds of their sexual orientation. But they weren't, it seems, very concerned about discrimination on grounds of religion. And yet that is just as crucial. It seemed to me in that case there was a balance between two different things there, but they didn't see it that way. They just only saw discrimination on one side. Churches, for instance. Now, there is a kind of view amongst some people that would say, if you don't like it, you're free to give up your profession. You must do as you're told. And I think that kind of overriding of deep feelings of conscience is very dangerous. Indeed, I think democracy depends on these deep feelings of conscience. If people actually in a democracy aren't acting in accordance basically with what they believe to be right, it all just becomes a power struggle, different interests against each other, no idea that anybody's acting for the common good, and that will destroy us.
Christians point to other examples where the law has been changed to accommodate the rights of minorities.
A Hindu man has won the right to be cremated on a traditional funeral pyre.
A Sikh teenager from South Wales has won her right to wear a religious bangle to school.
It is true that a number of Muslims have failed to win the right to wear the full veil at work. Even so, many forms of religious dress are now permitted in the workplace. But even supporters of human rights legislation worry that when it comes to Christian expressions of faith, the law is not always applied evenly. In 2006, a British Airways check-in worker was told by bosses to cover up a small Christian cross.
All of a sudden, I'm annihilated. Christianity is nil and void.
The company said it went against its uniform policy.
The Sikh turban is allowed, the Muslim hijab is allowed, and this is not allowed. I'm just wondering how you're going to get yourself out of this hole that you've dug yourself into.
BA later changed its mind. But Nadia Awida wants to prove that the original policy was discriminatory. She's taken her case to several court hearings, but in February, the Court of Appeal ruled against her. British Airways say the decision yet again confirms that they acted appropriately and lawfully. Nadia Awida wants to appeal to the higher Supreme Court and is being backed by the human rights group Liberty. It's a supporter of equality and human rights legislation. But its director, Shami Chakrabarti, says the way the law was applied in this case seemed to be discriminating against Christian beliefs.
I think it's incredibly important that human rights and equal treatment protect everyone, and that we demonstrate that we apply these very important laws and these very important values with an even hand. Nadia Awida was not hurting anybody. There was no practical reason at all why she couldn't do her job perfectly well whilst wearing a small cross around her neck. And I thought it was the height of intolerant bureaucracy that she was prevented from doing that.
Some Christians do perceive an inconsistency. The Hindu is allowed a funeral pyre, the Christian woman is not allowed to wear a cross, and that really gets people angry.
I've been involved in cases on behalf of people who are members of different religions and of none. One boy was arrested for calling Scientology a cult. We've represented a girl who was banned from wearing a Sikh bangle to school. But I think there's a more general problem here, which is that sometimes people are failing to recognise that faith is a very personal matter, and what we need to do is only interfere when it's truly necessary, rather than trying to treat everybody exactly the same.
Liberty is calling for a level playing field, tolerance for all. But some Christians insist that has not been their experience so far.
But there are always going to be winners and losers in equality legislation. You cannot, by definition, surely have an entirely level playing field.
I think you can have an entirely level playing field. It is a matter of historical fact that the struggle for democracy in Britain has been intrinsically linked with the struggle for religious tolerance and freedom.
The very phrase, human rights is sometimes rather spat out by people, isn't it? Who think it's, gone way too far and has lost any real meaning. But you were there, working as a lawyer in the Home Office in the year 2000, weren't you?
When I was in the Home Office at the time of the birth of the Human Rights Act, it was supposed to protect these very values of tolerance that we hold so dear in Britain. It was supposed to be the framework that we could all unite around and that would help us settle some of these differences and rubbing points that are sometimes inevitable in a diverse society. Now, lots of equality legislation has been very piecemeal, you know, race and gender first, sexuality and religion many years later, but the Human Rights Act is supposed to protect everybody. Let's remember that it protects freedom of thought, conscience and religion too.
We also asked Trevor Phillips of the Equality and Human Rights Commission to comment on the concerns raised, but he was too busy to meet our deadline for an interview. Human rights legislation may have led to a raft of competing rights, but the goal of human rights law remains to make Britain a more, not less, tolerant society. But for many Christians, the issue still remains. They feel that their faith is being sidelined. And for some, this raises a deeper concern. When faith is removed from the public arena, inevitably, it leaves behind an ideological vacuum. The question is, what fills it? It's tempting to say enlightened reason, liberalism. But how good is it at taking the moral high ground? Well, on the face of it, you might think, very good. In the last century, the liberal voice of reason has spoken out against one form of exploitation or another. And yet history shows that the track record of enlightened reason is as blemished as that of faith.
When the French Revolution pushed out religion, the result was the Jacobin terror. When the Russian Revolution abolished religion, totalitarianism filled the void. The guiding principle of liberalism, a commitment to tolerance and live and let live, has an inherent flaw. It's less likely to counter strong competing ideologies, whether they're religious or not.
Of course, we live in different times. But Christians and libertarians alike agree that the French and Russian revolutions do show what happens when a liberal society does not complement reason with faith.
I think there are broadly three choices about how you deal with this small question of religion in any society anywhere in the world. The first choice is to say we pick one religion and it must dominate everything else. That's been Afghanistan under the Taliban, maybe even Britain in earlier centuries. The alternative that some people promote, that's to say that all faith is dangerous, divisive mumbo-jumbo, and we want to stamp it out altogether or chase it completely from the public sphere into the private sphere, under the bed with the pornography. And that, if you like, is my caricaturing of Stalin's Russia, but also to some extent parts of Europe, like France. The human rights democratic pluralistic approach that I support says that, you know, we are all as human beings partly creatures of faith and of reason, and we interfere with individual freedom and people's behaviour only when it's proportionate to protecting others.
Surely modern Britain is no longer at risk of totalitarian ideologies or fundamentalist religions. Well, I'm about to meet someone who thinks we are.
I'm on my way to meet the former Bishop of Rochester, Michael Nazir Ali. Now, he grew up in Pakistan and became the youngest bishop in the Anglican Communion. He left there in the 1980s because of threats to his family. He is never a stranger to controversy. He's spoken out on many occasions on what he believes is the threat we all face because of the marginalisation of Christianity. You've spoken, Bishop Michael, about the moral vacuum in our society, the drift in our society, and the possibility of extremism filling that space. How real a danger is that in your mind?
We are, for the first time since the demise of Marxism as an ideology, facing another very insistent, comprehensive ideology which is claiming to address economic, political, social, every aspect of life. That is Islamism. When people of different religions and cultures and indeed languages began to arrive in this country, they should have been welcomed here on the basis of Christian hospitality. Instead of which, of course, they began to arrive at precisely the time when the force of the Judeo-Christian discourse was being lost in the public square. And so multiculturalism was invented by default. The idea was, well, we don't really know where we've come from, or we are trying to forget it. We don't know who you are and where you've come from, so let us just continue to live our lives separately as best we can. Well, we've seen what the result was. The result was isolated, segregated communities, not knowing one another. This certainly provided an opportunity for extremists to sell their own wares. We have no common view of citizenship, and we don't know how the different communities can contribute for the common good. At the moment, I welcome.
But other Christians are not so pessimistic about the outlook for society. Nick Spencer is Director of Studies at Theos, a theology think tank, founded with the support of Britain's Anglican and Catholic churches.
I'm aware of the moral vacuum argument, the idea that Christianity was our moral atmosphere. It has removed or been vastly diminished. That leaves a vacuum, and therefore, for example, Islamism kind of spreads into it. I'm not convinced by it. It may be the case in some circumstances. I think you're right that sort of culture abhors a moral vacuum, and therefore, if we don't believe in something, we don't start believing in nothing, we believe in something else. I don't think that something else is extremism. For a start, I think that Christianity is not as much diminished as a kind of cultural artifact as people sometimes think it is. You only have to look at the last census to show that in some sense or other there is a very, very significant residual attachment to Christian identity in the British population.
If we're asking the question, are Christians being persecuted, we've also got to ask, what kind of society are we living in today? Because everybody, Christian or otherwise, we just want to live our lives as we see fit. But if we carry on like this, that could become harder. And if it does, what do we do about it?
There will, of course, be many outside the church who will be happy to see Christianity consigned to the private sphere. And there are even Christians who feel that things are not as bad as their fellow believers claim.
I think Christianity both is and isn't being marginalised. There's certainly no persecution of Christians in this society in the way that there are in some societies around the world, and images of persecution, I think, are misplaced. The current government, the opposition, main opposition parties, have all spoken very positively about the role that Christianity plays in society, and in some senses are all falling over one another to work with voluntary organisations, and among them religious, Christian voluntary organisations, in the provision of public services on the ground. That certainly isn't marginalisation, that's partnership.
But for other Christians, there's still the problem of what they can do to make their voice heard. Ziauddin Sadar is a supporter of equality and human rights legislation, but nevertheless, he thinks Christians should speak out for their beliefs.
I think Christians in Britain face a very specific problem. They are totally and utterly marginalized. In fact, they are being stereotyped, just like Muslims are being stereotyped. So the common assumption is that Christians are irrational. When they open their mouth, nothing of logic and common sense comes. I think if I was a Christian, I'd be very upset.
So where have Christians gone wrong, and why? How did they, in sports part, how did they take their eye off the ball?
The Christians have kind of reduced religion to purely private matters to such an extent that they are now very reluctant to participate in public affairs. And that, I think, is a serious mistake that most of my Christian friends have made. Yes, religion is private, but religion has a great deal to say about the issues of contemporary times.
Even Tony Blair.
Yeah, Tony Blair is a very good example of the level of hypocrisy that we have kind of reached in contemporary society. So as long as he was Prime Minister, I don't do God. So he existed in a kind of strange, truncated self. He could not openly say that this is my, moral position. This is my
for fear of ridicule.
Not just fear of ridicule, but fear of losing office. Had he articulated his position openly, we would have had much more open debate and discussion. And I think he would have felt much more comfortable, and it would have been possible to change his views.
Of course, leading Christians are taking a stand. Bishops in the House of Lords defeated the government on the Equality Bill, this time. And a Catholic adoption agency has won a rethink on a decision forcing it to accept same-sex couples as parents. At local level too, Christians are making themselves heard. This is Oxford at the end of last year. The churches are celebrating something of a victory. The previous year, the City Council had run an ambitious programme of events called Winter Lights. Christians fought back, but with the support of the city's Muslims, Jews, Hindus and Sikhs.
I think we stand together because we realise that actually belief in God or in a transcendent reality is something that unites us over against an entirely different worldview.
They came together to write a joint letter to the council expressing their dismay at the name Winter Lights. The council insisted it had not sidelined Christmas, but rather aimed to enhance the traditional switch-on of the lights. But this year, the event was called Christmas in Oxford.
I think we were quietly pleased. I don't think I'd want to think in terms of success, failure, triumph, or whatever, but actually, yes.
One of those who welcomed the joint approach is local Muslim Monawar Hussain.
This levelling away any distinctiveness of faith or culture, I don't think that's healthy for society. I think part of one's identity is one's faith. It's very important for people to be able to articulate that in a positive sense.
Maybe Oxford points the way forward. So, are Christians being persecuted? No, they're not being tortured or killed like Christians in Pakistan and the Sudan. But a minority believe they are being sidelined and victimised. By the standards of a liberal society, that can feel like persecution. And that may be a source of strength for Christians. In Rome 2,000 years ago, the Christian faith grew in the face of persecution. In parts of China today, it continues to be persecuted, but is still thriving.
This is a debate which raises huge questions about where we are as a society and how we achieve genuine tolerance. It's about freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. It's not a debate we can afford to ignore, because if we continue to turn our backs on it, we may find we've lost more than we've gained.
We never went to church, just get on with work, and sometimes things all hurt. But it's hit me since you left us, and it's so hard not to search